Historical mysteries go back as long as humans have. Even before there were writing and civilizations, there were mysteries that archaeologists are only now uncovering. With so little remaining from the past, it can be incredibly hard to solve these mysteries. But with new discoveries, scientific advancements, and different perspectives of the mystery, historical mysteries are solved every year. Number 5. For 100 years, archaeologists and experts were baffled by a strange discovery found in eastern China. An ancient civilization was uncovered on the banks of the Yangtze River. This mysterious city left researchers with many questions, but one of the biggest mysteries was why the civilization disappeared. In 2021, scholars announced that they had found the answer. The civilization was given the name of the Liangshui city. The name itself translates to Beautiful Isle. It was first uncovered in 1936, and over the decades, more and more has been revealed about this unique archaeological site. As more was discovered, the location earned a new name, the Venice of Stone Age China. It was a well-earned name. The Liangshui civilization existed between 3300 and 2300 BC. The core area is spread across 14.3 square kilometers and lies in marshy land that sits between two mountains. To live in the area, the people of Liangshui needed to master the waterways. Canals were built, as well as dams and dikes to keep any floodwater at bay. 11 dams have been discovered so far. The canals should have been used for transportation, as well as managing the waterways. In an era before tamed horses or vehicles of any kind, the water would have been the easiest and quickest way to transport the materials needed to build the city. An artificial reservoir was also created, and archaeologists found signs of rice farms on the edges of the water. At the center of the city is an artificially terraced area, around 300 square meters in area, and sitting 12 to 116 meters above the ground. The entire area required complex engineering works. 10 million cubic meters of earth were used to create the dams and the rest of the city. The labor alone would have required thousands of people working for a decade to create the city. This was all done during the Stone Age, some 5,000 years ago. But the city itself has changed how archaeologists view these ancient cultures. Before the extent of Liangshui was uncovered, experts deemed 3 elements necessary for a culture to be called a civilization. Those were the appearance of the city, written characters, and metallurgy. Liangshui definitely fits the first 2 elements. There's little debate about calling the site a city. It's one of the largest and most complex in the area for the time period. On top of the size, there were clear signs of social hierarchy. Many cemeteries were uncovered, with different burials containing different levels of grave goods. Some were buried with only simple pottery, while others had more luxurious items like silk, ivory, and jade. The pottery that was uncovered indicated the second important element. About 600 drawings were found on the pottery, which is thought to be a kind of prototype writing, but no sign of metallurgy was uncovered. Instead, beautiful and delicate pieces made from jade had been uncovered. Jade has always been an important element in China, and its use dates back to the Neolithic period. The totems and intricate pieces indicated a high level of craftsmanship. They led to a debate over whether this jade craft could be considered the equivalent of metallurgy. Whatever the official definition, it was clear that Liangshui was extremely advanced, and showed elements that became part of Chinese culture for thousands of years. It changed how experts believed early Chinese civilizations originated. Some of these jade artifacts tell an interesting story. There was a recurring emblem on the artifacts of a human-shaped deity riding on an animal mask motif. It's believed to represent the Liangshui people's aim of conquering nature. They had bent the river to their needs and seemed to have mastered nature. Later emblems showed human features replaced animal motifs. In 2019, the ruins of Liangshui City were added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The ruins were described as an outstanding example of early civilization. But there was one important element that experts couldn't figure out. After existing for 1,000 years, the city and culture of Liangshui very suddenly disappeared. A number of theories were put forward. One was that some kind of warfare led to the destruction of the civilization. Archaeologists found signs of overcrowding, so that could have also been an element. But a thin layer of mud was a clue to another answer. They believed that flooding might have been responsible. It wasn't until 2021 that the true extent of that answer was revealed. By analyzing the chemical makeup of stalagmites from 2 nearby underwater caves, experts were able to piece together a timeline for weather events in the area. What they discovered showed something more complex than simple flooding. The entire climate of that area changed. The Liangshan culture had settled in the area during a dry period. This allowed the civilization to flourish. In the beginning, the dams were still necessary, but around 2400 BC, a mega drought occurred. This drought spread around the world. In Liangshan, dam building projects stopped as there was no need for them. But the drought didn't last forever. The warming of the nearby Pacific Ocean led to a period of heavy rainfall that lasted for decades. The Yangtze River would have overflowed. The water levels would have been too much for the dams and waterways of Liangshan to manage. As dams burst and the banks of canals flooded, people were forced to abandon the city. Unfortunately, this period of heavy precipitation was followed by centuries of humid conditions, which meant that the Liangshan people would never be able to recover their old way of life. New civilizations took the place of the Liangshan culture. What's interesting is what this could mean for our understanding of the Chinese flood myth. Like many cultures around the world, Chinese mythology has a story about a world-changing flood. In this case, the Great Flood isn't caused by some divinity that wants to wipe out humans. The story focuses more on how the emperor at the time tried to manage the flood. At first, an advisor used a special self-replicating soil to create dams. But the floodwaters continued to rise higher and higher, and the dams didn't work. A new emperor, the Great Yu, took charge and instead focused on channel digging and drainage. Yu was able to control the waters and went on to found the Shao dynasty. There are some similarities between the story and what archaeologists now believe happened in Liangshan. There was poor drainage in the area, as well as drought conditions that would have put more emphasis on conserving the water they did have. The city had relied on dams for so long that there may have been some cultural memory of this method failing during the floods, leading to the myth. Interestingly, the estimated date for the date of the Great Flood was around 2200 BC. About 100 years after the Liangshan city is believed to have been abandoned. Experts now believe that if Emperor Yu did exist, his rise would have come during another period of climate change, when more arid conditions returned. It may not have been through any of Yu's efforts that the Great Flood ended, just as it wasn't anything that the people of Liangshan did to cause the Great Flood to begin with. Number 4. Fog has long been a feature of horror movies and video games. It's a natural weather phenomenon, but there can be something quite eerie about it. When fog is thick enough, it can be impossible to see more than just a few feet ahead, and there could be anybody lurking in the haze. Most of the time, the fog clears not long after the sun comes up, and the creepy feeling passes. It's no more dangerous than any other weather phenomena, but in London, in 1952, a mixture of fog and something else claimed the lives of thousands of people. It was December 5th when the fog, or Great Smog, first came. Smog, unfortunately, was not uncommon in London at the time. The word had been coined in 1905 by a doctor specifically describing London's air. While most of the world had turned to oil as the main fuel source during the World Wars, coal was still being burned in London homes for heat. There was no concern about the smoke that spilled from every chimney in the city. Every now and again, it mixed with fog that naturally settled in the Thames River Valley to form smog, but it wasn't anything that anybody worried about. And when the Great Smog began, nobody thought there would be anything to worry about this time either. The smog came with a nasty smell like rotten eggs, but it was only periodic. People continued about their days and thought that the weather would improve the next day, but it didn't. For 5 days, London was enveloped in the smog. People reported that they couldn't see their own feet. Those who ventured outside would walk with one hand on a wall to stop themselves from getting lost in the gloom. Public transportation was canceled, as there was a high risk of crashes. Only the London Underground still ran. Most people didn't want to venture outside, but staying indoors didn't necessarily keep the smog at bay. It came in through windows and doors, and many people got sick without even going outside. 150,000 people ended up in the hospital with breathing problems. Many had pre-existing conditions, but some had been perfectly healthy before the smog came. Doctors worked hard, but unfortunately, an estimated 12,000 people lost their lives. Many more would have lifelong medical conditions. Animals were also impacted, with livestock becoming sick. It wasn't only health problems. There was a rise in burglaries during the Great Smog. Criminals figured that they could disappear into the haze and make a quick escape. On December 9th, the fog was finally broken away by winds. But people didn't forget the smog. The National Archive has many letters from people demanding something should be done about the smog. There were reports about planned experiments of smog-filled tunnels, and people volunteering to take part to make sure something like this didn't happen again. Even at that time, it was clear that the Great Smog was caused by coal burning. Over the following years, locals and national governments put Clean Air Acts into place, limiting the burning of coal in residential areas. The legislation worked, and London would be smog-free from the 1960s onwards. But scientists still weren't sure what caused the smog. We now know that it was a mixture of unique weather events and precise chemistry that caused the Great Smog. The first part of the cause was an anticyclone that brought a layer of high pressure over London. Essentially, that meant that the smog from chimneys and other warm air was trapped closer to the ground instead of rising and dissipating. A fog formed when water molecules began to cool, and the entire mixture stayed over London until the weather system changed. But that's only half the story. The reason why the smog was so devastating was due to the chemicals that were now floating in the air. We often think of carbon dioxide when we consider the pollution caused by burning fossil fuels, but it isn't the only pollutant caused by burning coal. Another is sulfur dioxide. It was the sulfur that gave the smog the smell of rotten eggs, and it was the sulfur that was causing so many health problems. The sulfur dioxide turned into sulfates and sulfuric acid. It was this that was so devastating when breathed in. But how the sulfur dioxide turned into sulfuric acid was still a mystery. The answer to this mystery was uncovered by scientists working on another problem. Smog may no longer be a problem in London, but it is still a problem in many parts of the world. China is home to many of the cities with the worst air pollution, and scientists studying the smog in Chinese cities figured out how the reaction works. Nitrogen dioxide, when mixed with sulfur dioxide in a humid environment, can turn the sulfur dioxide into sulfates. Nitrogen dioxide is another pollutant caused by burning coal, but the reaction only goes so far. When the air becomes too acidic, the reaction will reverse. In China, the smog isn't very acidic at all and is much closer to a neutral pH level, even though there are lots of sulfates in the air. Scientists found that this was caused by ammonia, which is used in agriculture as a fertilizer. After solving this problem, the researchers began to think of the Great Smog. Their experiments showed that the smog should have only gotten to a certain acidity level before stopping, but this didn't happen in London. There weren't high enough levels of ammonia in London for that to be a factor, so it had to be something else. There's one significant difference between the smog in London and the smog being studied in China, and that's the climate. The fog that settled on London in December of 1952 would have settled with or without the air pollution. In London, it was the fog that was the base for the smog. There were lots of large water molecules in the air, which diluted the acid level and meant more acid could be made before the reaction stopped. When the sun evaporated the fog, it only evaporated the water molecules. That left behind a blanket of airborne acid. When the Clean Air Act came into place, both the sulfur dioxide and the nitrogen dioxide that the Great Smog needed were removed from the air. But similar acts wouldn't necessarily help in other parts of the world. The scientists uncovered one of the differences between how the London Great Smog and the Chinese Great Smog are created. They highlighted that China is currently dealing with a lot more pollutant sources than London was, so stopping smogs in China wouldn't necessarily be as easy. Number 3. For centuries, the ancient city of Palmyra has fascinated researchers. The ruins of the city today sit in the desert of modern-day Syria. But at the start of the Common Era, the city was at the crossroads between the Roman Empire, the Persians, and the Far East. It was a rich melting pot of cultures, and one that we're only beginning to understand. Even though studying the city has become much harder in recent years, scholars have finally solved one of the most intriguing mysteries, that of the identity of the so-called anonymous god. There have been people living in Palmyra since the Stone Age, but the city really flourished between the 3rd century BC and 3rd century CE. It started out as a caravan city, a place where people could stop and rest while on the Silk Road, but gradually it grew. The people of Palmyra became merchants themselves and very rich. That was reflected in their temples, the remains of which exist today. Different groups would fight to donate the most to the temples, like the Grand Temple of Bel. Bel was originally called Bol and was one of the most important gods in pre-Hellenistic Palmyra, along with the gods for the moon and the sun. But as this was a crossroads of cultures, various different gods merged together. Bol became Bel-Marduk, a Mesopotamian god, and the patron god of Babylon. He was the king of the gods and obviously very important. There were other gods worshipped in the area, including the Semitic god, Baal-Shaman, who was sometimes associated with the Greek god Zeus. Temples have been found dedicated to gods from various cultures that would have passed through or been present in Palmyra at its height. There was even a temple for the cult worship of the Roman emperors, but there was one god that caught the attention of scholars. During excavation work, archaeologists found hundreds of inscriptions dedicated to an unnamed god. They were dated between the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, towards the end of the Golden Era for the city. The inscriptions would be found on stone altars, where worshippers would have used fragrant sacrifices of incense and juniper. They followed a praise formula, but the god that was being praised was never named. Instead, he was addressed using phrases such as "He whose name is blessed forever," "Lord of the universe," and "merciful." When researchers first uncovered these inscriptions, they had no idea who they could have been dedicated to. It was possible that this was a cult worshipping a single unnamed god. People drew similarities between this practice and the practice of not saying aloud the name of the Jewish god. The fact that this seemed to be a monotheistic cult also seemed like another strange link. But there was not enough information for anybody to draw any conclusions, and the god was simply referred to as the anonymous god of Palmyra. The answer to solving this riddle lay in looking elsewhere in the region. It was Polish archaeologist Alexandra Kubiak-Schneider who seemed to crack the code. She had studied the surrounding region and looked at the context of when these inscriptions were made to solve the puzzle. It seemed unlikely that this was a monotheistic cult, as that would be very unusual for the area and the time period. There were cults and religions that worshipped only a single god, but most religions still worshipped many gods. Kubiak-Schneider looked at inscriptions found elsewhere in Mesopotamia. These inscriptions dated back to the 1st century CE, so a few hundred years before the inscriptions of the so-called anonymous god, but they were very similar. There were inscriptions to the merciful god, but here the god was given a name. That was Bel-Marduk. In Babylonian mythology, the Bel-Marduk saved the world from the monster of chaos and darkness. Merciful was a fitting epithet for him. They also found inscriptions dedicated to the Lord of the World, which was very similar to the Lord of the Universe, but these could refer to either Bel-Marduk or Baal-Shaman. Finally, the phrase "He whose name is blessed forever" was used for many different gods. The conclusion that the anonymous god was some new mysterious god seemed to be far from the truth. Instead, the inscriptions were descriptions of known gods that had been used for centuries. Kubiak-Schneider concluded that the gods hadn't been named as a mark of respect, but also so the inscriptions could be more versatile. He whose name is blessed forever would be any god that answered the prayers of the worshipper. Our scholars were more cautious about saying the mystery was solved. This historical mystery dates back 2,000 years, so it's hard to know anything for certain. They also pointed out that there was a gap of at least 100 years between the inscriptions known to be dedicated to Bel-Marduk and Baal-Shaman, and those dedicated to the anonymous god. It's possible that these earlier inscriptions were adapted for a new god, but given that Bel-Marduk and Baal-Shaman were both prominent gods of Palmyra, and the descriptions were specifically used for these gods, it seems more than likely that Kubiak-Schneider's conclusion was correct. Number 2. In the mid-14th century, a disturbing wave of disease spread through Eurasia and northern Africa. Hundreds of millions of people lost their lives. Entire families disappeared. Between 30 and 60% of the population of Europe succumbed to the disease. It changed the fabric of society, and its knock-on effects led to the Age of Discovery and the world we know today. It's hard to overstate the impact the Black Death had on the world. For the people living through the pandemic, it would have likely seemed like the world was ending. The pestilence infected old and young, rich and poor alike. There appeared to be very little that could stop it, other than isolating the people who had the disease. The infection worked quickly. Some people would go to bed healthy and succumb to the disease overnight. Trying to figure out as much as we can about this disease has been a crucial study for scientists and archaeologists. The disease still exists today, infecting thousands of people every year. Thankfully, we now have the antibiotics which can cure the disease, but that advancement only came after centuries of study, as the mysteries of the disease were unraveled. In 2022, the mystery of where the Great Mortality originated was finally solved. Unraveling the mystery of the plague began with identifying the bacteria responsible. That happened in the 1890s when a scientist named Alexander Yersin identified Yersinia pestis. Y. pestis is a bacterium that lives in fleas that can then transmit the disease to their host mammals. However, not everyone was convinced that this bacterium caused the devastation of the Black Death. It didn't seem to be nearly as devastating in its modern form, and there were other diseases that seemed more fitting. In 2011, the first scientific breakthrough came. When the Bishop of London, Ralph Stratford, heard of the coming plague in 1348, he knew the city had to prepare. At the time, there was little that could be done to stop the disease, so the bishop prepared for the outcome. New graveyards were created and prepared to become plague pits. Sadly, the preparation proved necessary. Between 40 and 100,000 residents succumbed to the disease. In modern times, it's not uncommon for plague pits to be uncovered while working on new constructions beneath London. Some of the remains uncovered have since been preserved in the Museum of London, which gave researchers the perfect opportunity to study the disease. By studying DNA found in the teeth of the plague victims, scientists could decode the genome of the disease responsible and confirm that this was Y. pestis. But knowing that the disease was Y. pestis didn't answer the question of where it had come from. For a long time, the only answer that we had to this mystery was that it likely came from somewhere in Asia. Even that wasn't certain. Historical records showed the first instance of the Black Death on the continent was in 1347, when trade ships arrived in Sicily filled with sailors who had contracted the disease. The ship had come from Asia, but there was no way to say for sure that the disease hadn't been introduced to China from Europe. There were many theories. A popular theory was that the disease had originated somewhere in western China and traveled along trade routes. This was a period of time when there was a lot of trade along the Silk Road. The disease could easily have been transported along with the silk, food, and other goods that went between Europe and East Asia. Another theory was that it had actually come to Europe much earlier during the Mongol invasions and then mutated into something more devastating later. Gradually, technology and research have allowed scientists to put more pieces of the puzzle together and eventually come up with an answer. By analyzing DNA from the remains of other victims, it was discovered that there were 4 major strains of Y. pestis. The 4 strains all seemed to have appeared relatively quickly and had mutated from a single ancestor rather than from each other. Researchers called this the Big Bang event of plague diversity, finding that single ancestor would lead to the source of the plague. In the 1880s, a strange clue was added to the mix. Just west of the Izikul in the Chu Valley region of Kyrgyzstan are 2 cemeteries that date back to the 1300s. There was a surge in the number of people buried in the small cemeteries in the 1330s. In particular, of the 467 tombstones dated between 1248 and 1345, more than 100 came from the years 1338 and 1339. Mysteriously, inscriptions on some of those tombstones indicated that the person had passed away due to Maltana, a Syriac word for pestilence. Given this is one of the many words used to describe the Black Death, researchers were intrigued as to why so many people appeared to have caused pestilence 8 years before the plague outbreak in Europe. The site was controversial, as it seemed to go against the popular theory of the disease originating in China. But in 2022, scientists decided it was time to investigate the clue. They found that in the 1880s, the remains of 30 people from these cemeteries were excavated. They had been kept in a museum and were now the perfect specimens for the scientists. DNA was extracted from the teeth of 3 of the victims. Their tombstones indicated that they passed away in 1338 from pestilence. What researchers found was a strain of Y. pestis, with only some slight differences from the strains found in London. The genetic sequence made it clear that one had evolved from the other. As these people passed away almost a decade before anybody in Europe contracted the disease, it was obvious that this was the original strain. Scientists believe that these cemeteries near Lake Issyk-Kul contain the trunk of the modern evolutionary tree, which was the ancestor to the Black Death and almost all of the modern strains of plague that still exist today. The town where these people would have lived lay on a trade route between China and Europe. The people traveling along that route may never have known that anybody in the town was sick, but by passing through, they took with them the disease, which would then go on to become more viral and more devastating. How the people of the Chu Valley region contracted the disease is the next mystery that experts will work to solve, but they already have a pretty good idea. Plague reservoirs are communities of rodents where the disease can remain for extended periods of time. The rodents or fleas that live on them might be infected, but the plague doesn't cause too much damage to them. It's only when it moves to other animals, like humans, that it begins to rapidly take lives. One such reservoir is believed to exist around the nearby Tian Shan Mountains. The researchers found that marmots living nearby are infected with Y. pestis. This strain is the closest modern strain to the one that wiped out the human residents in the area almost 700 years ago. It seems likely that the disease originated here and spread to the humans of the Chu Valley before rapidly mutating. The cause of such a rapid mutation at this period of time isn't clear, and there are still many mysteries of the Black Death waiting to be solved. Number 1. For centuries, the Great Lakes have played an important role in travel and trade in North America. But the lakes can be dangerous, and dark legends have been created about the water and what may lie beneath it. The Lake Michigan Triangle has now become infamous in the world of the supernatural. There are many stories of ships sailing across Lake Michigan, with the triangle that spreads from Ludington to Benton Harbor to Manitowoc never to be seen again. The earliest of these mysterious disappearances attributed to the Michigan Triangle was the Thomas Hume. The disappearance of the Thomas Hume has fascinated historians for centuries, but it was finally solved when the wreck of the ship was rediscovered, sitting on the lake bed. The Thomas Hume was built in 1870 and started life as the H.C. Albrecht. It was 132 feet in length and designed for carrying cargo at the sea. In 1878, she was sold to Hackley and McGordon Lumber Mill in Muskegon. There was a huge demand for lumber in the late 1800s, and Charles Hackley and then partner James McGordon dominated the industry. They expanded to own not just the mill, but also the timberlands and the transport of the logs. That was where the Albrecht came in. The ship needed to be refitted so that it could withstand the weight of the lumber. A third mast was added to the schooner to reduce labor costs. The masts had wire rigging, making the ship the first in the area to have such technology. When McGordon passed away in 1880, Thomas Hume became Hackley's partner in the company. Hume was an Irish immigrant who had risen through the ranks in the lumber industry to become Hackley's bookkeeper. The Albrecht was renamed in Hume's honor in 1883, and the Thomas Hume began work sailing across Lake Michigan. For several years, the ship was in service of Hackley and Hume without too many issues. It underwent other repairs, and one man who'd sailed as a passenger aboard reported that there were leaks. But overall, it continued to contribute to the success of the business. That came to a sudden and mysterious end in 1891. The Hume transported lumber from Muskegon to Chicago and was set to begin the return journey on May 21, 1891. It would be joined by one of the company's other ships, the Rouse Simmons. But a squall had begun over the lake. Squalls are described as sudden but localized storms. Normally they're not too big, but it's still worrying for the captain of the Rouse Simmons. He decided not to sail back to Muskegon in the poor weather and remained in Chicago. The captain of the Hume had no such worries and sailed off north and east towards Muskegon. Muskegon sits about a third of the way between Ludington and Benton Harbor, 2 points on the Michigan Triangle. The journey from Chicago would take the Thomas Hume through that mysterious area, but it was a journey the ship and its 7-man crew had done countless times before. When the Rouse Simmons arrived in Muskegon 2 days later, it expected to find the Thomas Hume sitting in the harbor, but the ship was nowhere to be found. It was only then that Hackley and Hume realized that the ship was missing. At first, they thought that the ship must have gone to another port for safety, but there were no reports of the missing ship arriving anywhere nearby. A search was set out to try to find the ship, or at least the wreckage. There was no sign of either. It was as if the Hume and the 7 men aboard had vanished into thin air. Unfortunately for the company, the ship wasn't insured. That meant a loss of $6,000, but Hume would write in a letter to his wife that it wasn't the loss of the ship that upset him, but the loss of the 7 men aboard. While Hume was upset about the loss of the men, others didn't think they were so innocent in the disappearance. It seemed unbelievable that the entire ship could disappear without a trace. There were rumors that the men aboard the ship had sailed it to another secluded port. There it was repainted and disguised as another ship. They weren't victims of some wreck, but had actually stolen it. Hackley himself didn't believe this rumor, but he also didn't believe that this was some tragic accident. He believed a larger steamship had collided with the Thomas Hume, which caused the sinking. The steamer's captain had then sworn the crew to secrecy. The company issued a reward of $300 for anybody who could provide information that would help locate the ship, but it was never claimed. Not long after the disappearance, a clue added to the mystery. A bottle washed ashore in Benton Harbor with a strange note. It read, "We the undersigned are passengers of the Thomas Hume. The schooner's hold is rapidly filling with water, and we have no hope of escape. We are on the St. Joseph course and have been drifting for hours. We have friends in McCook, Nebraska and Elkhart, Indiana. Please notify them of our fate." It was signed by Frank Maynard and Wilbur Grover. Neither were crew members aboard the ship. At first, it seemed like the note was the result of a prankster. The Hume was a cargo ship not fit for passengers, though it wasn't unknown to take on 1 or 2 passengers for its journeys. It also seemed unlikely that someone from Nebraska or Indiana would be able to determine the route that the ship was on. Later research would prove that a man by the name of Wilbur Grover did exist, and had lived a few miles outside of Elkhart, Indiana, around the same time as Hume's disappearance. He was absent from the 1900 census, indicating he disappeared or passed away by that point. But even if the note in the bottle was legitimate, it didn't help to locate the ship. As time went on, the mystery of the Thomas Hume was added to by other mysterious disappearances on the Great Lakes, and Lake Michigan in particular. The Thomas Hume wasn't the first ship to disappear on the Great Lakes. That was Le Griffin, the first ship to ever set sail on the upper Great Lakes that disappeared on the return from her maiden voyage. But the Thomas Hume was the earliest to be definitively associated with the legend of the Michigan Triangle. Thousands of ships have met their end in the area that encompasses the triangle. Even some planes have gone down in the area. In the early 1900s, UFOs were associated with the area. It definitely seemed that there was something strange going on which couldn't be explained by natural means. In the 1990s, a salvage team first stumbled across an unidentified wreckage in the southern area of Lake Michigan. Sports divers and underwater archaeologists were brought in to investigate the wreck and try to identify it. They were not permitted to remove anything from the ship, so they had to study the artifacts while still underwater. They found a variety of artifacts that dated the ship to the late 1800s. These included coins that were all dated to before 1891. Some were small coins from foreign countries, indicating a crew of immigrants. There was also a large pile of clothing. The still water inside the ship had preserved the cloth, so only the threads at the seams had been destroyed. There was also a large number of shoes, more than the 7 pairs needed for the crew. Researchers believed this indicated that the crew had changed into rubber boots due to the bad weather conditions. A button from a heavy woolen jacket was found, and it was inscribed with the name Nicole the Tailor. Later research showed that this was the mark of the maker of expensive clothing. This clothing wouldn't have been worn by any of the sailors, who wouldn't have been able to afford it, but this could have been a clue that there really were passengers aboard when the ship sank. In 2006, the researchers had found enough evidence to confirm that this was the missing Thomas Hume. The ship was almost completely intact. Its mast had broken, but there was no indication that it had been struck by another ship. Instead, it appeared to have capsized in the storm and sunk in a single piece. It now lay upright on the lake bed, almost perfectly preserved. The finding confirmed that it had sunk in 1891, and it hadn't been hit by another vessel. The 7 sailors aboard, and any possible passengers, were not thieves, but victims of a tragic accident. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.